Okay, so we're gonna pick up from where we left off on Moorish Paradigm, Book 6. Pieces of the Puzzle. The Human Genome Project, Opening the Book of Life. Revelations chapter 20, verse 12. Quote, "And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works." Moors, I would like to talk to you now about the science of genetics and some of the recent findings of the Human Genome Project. The reason why the science of genetics is so important for us as Moor scientists is because we realize that the human body or organism is the key to understanding the nature of the universe. Microcosmic man is a scale model of the macrocosmic man or God, as above, so below. We are exact scale models of the universe, macrocosm, only on a smaller scale, microcosm. And the biomolecular worlds are scale models of us on an even smaller scale. Thus, the directive, man, know thyself. This is because by knowing self, you will know all of creation. We must always keep in mind that we, new Moors, must use ourselves as the blueprint or model upon which or build our society, economics, government, etc. In the Bible, it states, quote, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And that was the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, or book 1, verse 26 through 27. This quote, image and likeness, unquote, refers to our microcosmic scale model relationship with Allah, God, the Great Spirit. In order for us Moors to do our job in raising fallen humanity, we must first pull ourselves out of our own bootstraps and raise ourselves to a higher level of existence. By pulling ourselves up, who are the most fallen of humanity, we will have qualified ourselves to perform our job in uplifting the world. The forms of society and social orders that we formerly lived in accord with cannot help or save us or the planet in this day and age. The previous social orders were formed and developed under different times and circumstances than those in which we live now or now live. Nature dictates to us all that you either adapt yourself or environment or die. This is why Noble Jew Ali said the new Moors will put the old Moors in the back seat and fulfill his ultimate plan. The new world that is emerging right now will be vastly different than the old one. In fact, the new world that is emerging will even be vastly different than the way things are presently. Not only will the knowledge gained from the Human Genome Project and other technologies change our knowledge of man's past, but it will also change the way we live in the future. We will be, and already are, being affected by this new knowledge, whether we choose to realize it or not. Thus, I will discuss in this section what is being discovered, quote unquote, and what are some of its implications. The phrase human genome means the complete set of human genes found within our 23 chromosomes. The Human Genome Project is the mapping of this human genome. The project has completed the mapping of the human genome and has published a first draft in the February 15, 2001 issue of Nature. Moors, we as the human family of the planet Earth have reached a very important milestone in the development of the human race. Prior to this, only a very few adepts knew the true science of the human genome, or book of life. The human genome, or book of life, has now been published into a readable format. Quote, imagine that a genome is a book. There are 23 chapters called chromosomes. Previously, there were 24. Every chapter contains several thousand stories called genes. Each story is made up of a paragraph called exons, which are interrupted by advertisements called introns. Each paragraph is made up of a word called codons. Each word is written in letters called bases. There are 1 billion words in the book, which makes it longer than 5,000 volumes, the size of this one, or as long as 800 Bibles. Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters by Matt Ridley, page 6. That was a quote from that book. Thus, each one of the approximately 100 trillion cells in our body has a nucleus inside of which there are 23 chapters or pairs of chromosomes. We previously had 24 chromosomes, but 2 of them fused together, forming 1. Thus, we now have 23. Primates still have 24 pairs. Each of these chromosomes is made up of proteins and nucleic acid forming chains or strands. Each chromosome chain or strand is made up of subunits called nucleotides containing sugar or a phosphate group and one of the 4 bases A, C, G, T, which correspond to adenine, crystosine, guanine, and thymine. Thus, this book of life is written using a very ingenious alphabet of 4 letters, which in turn form 3-letter words called codons. These codons in turn form paragraphs called exons. These paragraphs or exons are divided into introns, or so-called junk DNA. The exons or paragraphs form the genes, which are like stories within the chapters called chromosomes. This book of life can do things normal books cannot. This book can both be read itself, translation, and photocopy itself, replication. Replication or photocopying itself is possible because of the A base will only pair up with the T base, and the G will only pair up with the C. So a single strand of DNA will replicate itself by putting together complementary strand with the A's opposite, the T's and the G's opposite, the C's forming the aforementioned double helix, the original strand and its opposite forming a pair. To make a copy of the original strand, the opposite strand merely separates and then puts together its opposite, which will be an exact copy of the original strand. Ingenious. And here's a schematic. The DNA sequence variation in a gene can change the protein produced by the genetic code. A couple examples. Sometimes when replicating, photocopying itself, mistakes happen. Sometimes a letter is omitted, the wrong letter is inverted or inserted, or a sentence or paragraph is reversed. This is known as a genetic mutation, which can be good or bad depending on the context. The information contained in your genetic code is your genotype, that which is hidden in each cell and is inherited. The characteristics such as the color of your hair, eyes, etc., is what is known as your phenotype, that which you express. The process of translation is key in translating that which is hidden, genotype, into that which is revealed, phenotype. Hmm. The way translation works is a copy is made of the text of a gene, just like a replication, but instead of forming its opposite, ATGC, on a strand of DNA, it is formed on RNA, which is similar but slightly different. RNA uses the same letters except that it substitutes uracil, in place of T, thymine. This RNA copy is called messenger RNA and is edited by the removal of the introns, so-called junk DNA, and the splicing or joining together of exons. When then microscopic machines called ribosomes move along the messenger RNA, translating each three-letter codon into one letter of a different alphabet made up of 20 letters, each letter corresponding to different amino acids. These amino acids form a chain that matches the messenger's RNA codons. Every three codons on the messenger RNA corresponds to one amino acid on the amino acid chain. The chain of amino acids folds itself into a distinctive shape depending on its sequence of amino acids, becoming what is known as a protein. Quote, almost everything in the body, from hair to hormones, is either made of proteins or made by them. Every protein is a translated gene. And that's a quote from Genome, the autobiography of a species in 23 chapters by Matt Ridley, page 8. Thus, it can be seen that it is proteins that are building blocks of the temple or the body, and the genes are the instructions on how the building blocks are to be cut, dressed, lifted, and placed in the temple. We are temples, which during the construction of, there was not heard of the sound of axe nor hammer. Quote, in the house, when it was building, was built of stone made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe, any tool of iron heard in the house while it was building. And that was a quote from the Bible, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7, giving an analogy. One of the big surprises that has resulted from the Human Genome Project has been the fact that it was initially thought that the more complex an organism is, the more genes it would have. Thus, it was estimated that there were at least 100,000 genes on our 23 chromosomes. It has been found that we only have about 30,000 genes, and this is not much more than certain types of microscopic worms and even insects. This shows that it is not so much the amount of genes that determines complexity, but somehow the interaction with the organism and environment that play a role. As a matter of fact, it is even now being hypothesized that how we think and perceive the world, our paradigm, can actually affect and even mutate our genetic code within our lifetime. Quote, researchers working in this new field mainly consider biophoton emission as a cellular language or a form of non-substantial biocommunication between cells and organisms. Over the last 15 years, they have conducted enough reproducible experiments to believe that cells use these waves to direct their own internal reactions as well as to communicate among themselves and even between organisms. For instance, photon emission provides a communication mechanism that could explain how billions of individual plankton organisms cooperate in swarms, behaving like superorganisms. And that was a quote from The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge by Jeremy Narby, page 127 through 128. Quote, I knew of no neurological mechanism on which to base this working hypothesis, but I did know that DNA was an aperiodic crystal that traps and transports electrons with efficiency and that emits photons, in other words, electromagnetic waves, at ultra weak levels, currently at the limits of measurement. And all this more than any other living matter. And that was a quote from The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and Origins of Knowledge by Jeremy Narby, once again, page 109 through 110. Quote, in the early 1980s, thanks to the development of a sophisticated measurement device, a team of scientists demonstrated that the cells of all living things emit photon light at a rate of up to approximately 100 units per second and per square centimeter of surface area. They also show that DNA was the source of this photon emission. During my readings, I learned with astonishment that the wavelength of which these DNA emits these photons correspond to the narrow band of visible light. Its spectral distribution range is at least from infrared at about 900 nanometers to ultraviolet up to 200 nanometers. DNA emits photons, which have regularity that the researchers compare the phenomenon to an ultra-weak laser. A coherent source of light, like a laser, gives the sensation of bright colors, luminances, and an impression of holographic depth. And that was a quote once again from The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge by Jeremy Narby, page 125 through 126. In that book, he shows that the DNA in a person, plant, or animal is actually be able to communicate with the DNA in another person, plant, or animal through the emission of laser-like photons. The above quote is very important in that it has important ramifications, especially when taken into consideration with the following quote. This must be the reason why we talk about getting certain vibes from certain people. It is their DNA communicating with yours. Hallucinogenic plants and DNA, tree of the knowledge and good and evil. This section is not for the purpose of encouraging the use of hallucinogenic plants among novices, but to show that they were the means used by our ancestors to produce an altered state of consciousness in which we understood the light teachings of DNA. Jeremy Narby studied in the Amazon with the shamans known as ayahuascos. They were called this because they ingested and utilized a hallucinogenic plant known as ayahuasca as a source of knowledge. Ayahuasca. The first thing that intrigued him was how did these so-called primitive people know how to concoct the brew using ayahuasca, which seemingly demands an incredible detailed knowledge of botany and chemistry. Although the plant ayahuasca contains the hallucinogenic substance dimethyltryptamine, which is also secreted by the brain. When the plant is swallowed, the hallucinogen has no effect because of a specific enzyme in the stomach called monoamine oxidase, which blocks it. Somehow, these Amazonian shamans knew they had to mix it with another plant, which activates the specific enzyme in the stomach, and which then swallows the hallucinogen and ayahuasca to reach the brain. Quote, the sophistication of this recipe has prompted Richard Evans Skrulitz, the most renowned ethnobotanist of the 20th century, to comment, quote, one wonders how peoples in primitive societies with no knowledge of physiology even hit upon a solution to the activation of a alkaloid by a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Pure experimentation? Perhaps not. The examples are too numerous and may be even more numerous with future research. And that was a quote from The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and Origins of Knowledge by Jeremy Narby, once again, page 10 through 11. Studying field herbology myself, I often wondered how did our ancestors ever figure out what plant is good for this or that. Oftentimes, the medicine men would say that the plants themselves taught them that they were good for. This Dr. Doolittle answer never made sense to me. The reason that it never made sense to me was because when they said the plant told them or taught them, I was naturally thinking in terms of normal human verbal communication. Now, since reading this book, I now understand that the plants were communicating on a biomolecular DNA level via the light photons emitted by the DNA. This also explains why, after studying plants in the wild alone or with my teacher, Brother Rashan Abdul Hakim or Reddy Duckett, I would have dreams in which the plants I had seen would overwhelm me in my dreams. They would be all around me like a crowd of people, all talking at the same time, as if trying to tell me something or get my attention. I could never make out what was being said because they were all talking at the same time. In my normal conversation or in my normal conscious state, I could not understand their language. What the ancestor shamans would do is use certain hallucinogenic plants to bring their consciousness down to the biomolecular DNA level. And at that level, the communication of the plant to the shaman manifested itself like a vision, dream, or trip in which the plant's teaching was like looking at a television set. Wow, that's deep right there. Thinking further about this, it made me realize that the pineal gland and the brain must also play a role in this communication. Although this is not in the book by Jeremy Narby, I remember from studying the pineal gland that it is often referred to as the third eye and is recognized as such in mystical traditions around the world. In certain reptiles, it is literally a vestigial eye and is visible on the head. In humans, it is receded into the interior of the brain, but is still sensitive to light and dark. It regulates the body in accord with daylight and night. In the day, it secretes serotonin, and in the night, it secretes melatonin, connected with the melanin, which is what makes our skin dark. It is also connected with dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness. Not only do the individual cells of our body receive DNA communications from other people, plants, and animals, but the pineal gland is what actually gives us the ability to visualize this communication in the form of dreams and visions. In many of the visions of the shamans, it is reported that they see bright luminescent colors, as well as snakes and ladders. Some even say that these snakes are what teaches or communicates with them. Below is a description of an actual ayahuasca trip experienced by the Jeremy Narby, the author of The Cosmic Serpent. Quote, deep hallucinations submerged me. I suddenly found myself surrounded by two gigantic boa constrictors that seemed 50 feet long. I was terrified. These enormous snakes are there. My eyes are closed and I see the spectacular world of brilliant lights. And in the middle of these hazy thoughts, the snakes start talking to me without words. They explain that I am just a human being. I feel my mind crack, and in the fissures, I see the bottomless arrogance of my presuppositions. I stood up feeling totally lost, stepped over the fluorescent snakes like a drunken tightrope walker, and begging their forgiveness, headed toward a tree next to the house. And that was a quote from Cosmic Serpent DNA, page 6 through 7. The reason these shamans see snakes and serpents in their vision may be because their consciousness is actually operating on a biomolecular level, and the talking snakes and ladders may be actual strands of DNA communicating via photons. Thus, the snake spitting fire, photon light, into the pineal gland as shown in the Egyptian picture below. So here's a visual of a snake spitting that gas, that fire. Serpents or snakes have always been a symbol of knowledge and wisdom. This motif of a talking snake or serpent connected with knowledge and wisdom is also found in the book of Genesis and the Bible story of the Garden of Eden. The knowledge bestowed in Genesis was connected with the fruit of a particular tree of knowledge of God and evil, which not only had the ability to open their eyes, but will make them as gods, knowing good and evil. Could this tree and its fruit have been a hallucinogen that brought their consciousness down to the bioelectrical level from, or the biomolecular level from whence they learned the knowledge of good and evil from a serpent, DNA? They were told that the day that they ate it, they would surely die. Not only did they not die that day, but they became as gods. And here's a quote from the Bible. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest, thereof thou shalt surely die. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil, and know, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. And that was the Bible, book of Genesis. Notice it also says, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life. The fruit of the tree of life is the knowledge of the book of life, or the human genome, whose findings are promising to allow us to live forever by discovering and eliminating the very roots of disease and death embedded in our genetic code. Things are getting pretty noggle, as Don John would say. So now we're going to a section, Europeans descended from only a handful of Africans. Here's the article above. In the article above, it states that Europeans, many have descended from as little as a few hundred Africans. The study was carried out by Eric Lander. He compared 300 chromosomes from people of Sweden, Central Europe, and Nigeria. The differences in the genetic patterns reveal that the Europeans were descended from fewer ancestors than the African. In other words, they descended through an evolutionary bottleneck. The Nigerian chromosomes were well shuffled, indicating a wide gene pool, whereas the European chromosomes had long stretches of unshuffled genetic material, which indicates that a much smaller number of chromosome types entered the mix. It also means that they were restricted to a small area for a long time without mixing with another. While in college, I took classes on genetics and human variation in order to look into what Elijah Muhammad taught regarding the origins of the so-called Caucasian people connected with the story of Yaqub. Yaqub was said to have been an ancient Moorish scientist who headed a team of scientists whose goal was to produce a race of people unlike our people. He was said to have done this using a few thousand of our people. In studying genetics, I found out that light skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and other traits of what was termed as pure whites by Hitler were recessive traits, whereas dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes were dominant traits. Therefore, given random population mixing, how could you end up with a population with recessive traits? I learned that in order to get a population of people with the aforementioned recessive traits, you would have to have genetic isolation in order to limit the gene pool and to not allow outside genes in. According to Elijah Muhammad, Yaqub carried out his experiment on an island, the island of Patmos, Isle of Dr. Monroe or Moreau. You would also have to have selective breeding, or in other words, you must only allow only those with certain desired traits to reproduce, and you must not allow those with unwanted traits, i.e., dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair, to reproduce. Elijah Muhammad taught that Yaqub and scientists killed those with dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes at birth, thereby only allowing those with light skin, light hair, and light eyes to reproduce. Quote, we're still in the early days for this, but it is remarkable how much of human chromosomes can be read as a history book. We are going to be able to say how human populations are related to each other when people arrived there and how many people likely arrived in different places. And that was a study researchers Europe's founders by Emma Ross. Reuters Friday, April 20th, 2001. So the findings in the article seem to support theoretically that Elijah Muhammad's regarding Yaqub, yet it said that Elijah Muhammad only had a third grade level education. How did he conduct a story that was sound according to science genetics and the recent findings of the Human Genome Project? People on islands can suffer both suffer from genetic drift. Because of the limited amount of genes in the gene pool of the original settlers on the island, their traits will drift in a certain direction if there is no outside intermixture. For instance, on the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean, all of our people there have orange afros. Wow, the Solomon Island, orange afros. Okay, interesting. This is because the original settlers had a preponderance of the gene for orange afros, and because they did not mix much outside the island, they underwent genetic drift towards orange afros. The fact that the articles said that Europeans came from no more than a few hundred Africans, and that their chromosomes had long stretches of unshuffled genetic material indicating a much smaller number of chromosome type entering the mix, suggests that there may be some truth to, at least theoretically, in Elijah Muhammad's story of Yaqub. I say this not to be racist, but in order that we, as may study and arrive at the truth of the history of the human family of the planet Earth. It looks like the book of life has been opened and the truth will soon be revealed. I can't wait. Perhaps finally, the stone that the builders rejected may one day become the head of the cornerstone. Quantum physics proves that we can change the world by changing our paradigm. The first goal of this journal, is to prompt us into changing our reality by first changing our paradigm. Recent findings in quantum physics theories proves the ability of our consciousness via paradigm or perceptions to affect reality. This study was reported in the February 26 issue of Nature, volume 391, on page 871 through 874. The study was carried out at the Weizmann Institute of Science, and it showed how a beam of electrons is actually affected by the act of being observed. The more the beam was observed, the greater was the effect on it. Electrons and light photons seem to behave differently depending on whether or not someone is watching. When they are being watched, they behave like particles. When they are not being watched, they behave like waves. That is like a bowling ball looking like a bowling ball while you are looking at it, but then turning into a wave when you turn your back. There have also been cases where subatomic particles behave one way in one particular laboratory and another way in another laboratory, based on the perceived notions of the scientists in those laboratories. This has even made some quantum physicists question themselves as to whether they are actually discovering these so-called subatomic particles or whether they are actually creating them. It seems that the effect of consciousness in affecting reality is immediate to the subatomic level. This implies that on the everyday human level, it may take a more concentrated effort over a longer period of time to affect reality. We can change our reality and place ourselves in heaven at once if we change our paradigm collectively. Truly, life is what we make it. So next time you find yourself walking along the beach, ask yourself, am I walking on the beach or am I laying this beach out as I walk? New and rarely seen Olmec artifacts, plus additional information on Olmec culture. The following pictures all come from the excellent book Olmec World, Ritual and Rulership. So a couple pictures. Olmecs. Above, a standing figure holding a ceremonial staff. This figure is from Veracruz and dates from around 900 to 600 BC. It is made of light green jadeite, oxidized or stained brown. The hair is in locks and is bound by a band and held in place in the back by a disc. In the ear is one of the characteristic ear spools or plugs seen in the Olmec images in previous issues. So once again, here's another picture of the Olmec with the locks pulled back, you know, like a regular brother on the street. My boy Montreal L rock is like that sometime, you know. We've been doing this, you know. Here go another picture of a brother. Another standing figure holding a ceremonial staff, as we can see, and dressed in similar attire. The features of both of these statues leave no doubt as to their Hamatite, Cushite, Canaanite origin. This figure is made of gray-green jade and is also from Veracruz. So we're talking about Mexico. It is dated at 900, 400 BC. The dates of these and the following figures may actually be older than stated in light of the new archaeological dates coming to light, as mentioned in the previous issue. The ceremonial staffs held by both of these figures usually denote royal power and authority, and was also usually made of jade. The use of jade was highly prized, as was the case among the Shang dynasties of China, to which the Olmec was related. The Olmecs related to the Shang dynasties, covering the whole planet, man. So here's another one. So this is a Yukito from Mexico. Yukitos were used as protective coverings in the sacred ball games played by the Olmec, Mayans, and Aztecs. Like basketball, the object was to get a rubber ball through a hoop, but you could not use your hands. Instead, you had to use your hips. Wow. This Yukito is dated at 900 through 600 BC. Because of its Hamitic, Cushitic, and Canaanite features, it is associated with the massive stone Olmec heads seen in issue 1 of the Journal of the Moorish Paradigm. The plot thickens. Now on the left, this is a figure known as a tenant. These may have been used as ball court markers, which were inserted into walls so that the bust, as shown here, protruded from the wall. It is carved from pitted volcanic stone and comes from Tres Zapotes, Veracruz. It is dated at 1000 through 600 BC. It looks very similar to the tenant picture in issue 1. Let's fly right here. That look cold. So this is an Olmec bib pendant, which was placed inside of an early 18th century decorative niche. The Olmec figure, which forms the centerpiece of the niche, may actually be one of the oldest Olmec objects known outside of Mexico. It was sent from Mexico to the collection of Albrecht V of Bavaria, possibly before 1511, and is now in the Schatzkammer der Residenz, Munich. With this, I close this issue. Be sure to check out the appendix. Until next time, peace and love. Get another look at the ancestor. And once again, here are a couple of books that you can cross-reference the information from tonight. You see, it's a plethora of books. You know, why not get all the angles and see how all these things come together like a puzzle. You know, you become more and more clear of how everything went down. You know, fast forward, now you feel more comfortable enforcing political status because you're not buying into the fabricated story of you've been shipped here, something like that. But until next time, this is Morris Paradigm, Book 6, continued. Hope this was eye-opening for somebody.